Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi, and I have with me today my colleague Manoj Kewalramani, and we will talk about the interesting developments that happened last week, especially in the context of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting of foreign ministers that happened in Goa, and it did see attendance from including FMs from Pakistan and China. Then there was also interesting that Xinjiang, the Chinese FM, went from India to Pakistan, where he held bilateral talks with Pakistan and also trilateral talks with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China. So, Manoj, welcome.
Thank you so much, sir. Good to be here.
Okay, so we'll straight right in. So, would you say it is at least a sign of some positive momentum that China and Pakistan FMs both came to India for the SCO Summit, or it's because it is SCO, so both China and Pakistan would have to come anyways? Should one subscribe any significance to that point?
I think that there has been a lot of discussion in India over the last few months about what sort of a role would China play, whether China would be a disruptive actor, given, this being sort of India's coming out party, given that it's the chairperson of the SCO and it's hosting also the G20. And would China sort of be a spoiler? There's been lots of concern about, whether Beijing would escalate on the boundary, whether it would create irritants for India. To me, I think a lot of that is very misplaced and it misunderstands Chinese foreign policy. I think that Beijing understands. At the G20, it has a different approach. At the SCO, it has a different approach. The SCO is fundamentally China-led. Beijing is looking to make it work. It wants to see this as an institution that develops with greater purpose, has greater members, all of whom that might have some degree of anxiety with the role of the United States in their region, and want to create or want to sort of hedge to some degree. And it wants to therefore build the SCO into an institution to that effect, which is to balance against the United States in terms of its competition with the United States. Now, if that is your strategic objective, and if India is a member of the SCO, knowing fully well that India is essentially, well, not necessarily hedging, it leans towards the United States, but it is because of its geographic proximity to China, cannot necessarily, and because of many other reasons, does not necessarily become an ally of the United States. Do you want to antagonize India and vitiate the SCO? So I don't think that, therefore, there was any rational reason for Beijing not to engage pragmatically in SCO meetings, which it has done. The defense minister visited, the foreign minister visited, Xi Jinping will visit. The interesting thing in that Xi Jinping visit, when the SCO Leaders Summit happens, will be whether there is a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi. I think that's an opportunity where there will be a bilateral meeting. I say why this is important is because for the last 3.5 years, there has been no bilateral meeting between the two individuals, whether online or whether in person. The last direct bilateral exchange that I can recall was in April 2020, which was a pro forma exchange where the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese Premier and the Indian President and the Chinese President exchanged letters on the 70th anniversary of the establishment of bilateral ties. After that, there has been a brief engagement in November 2022 last year in Bali at the sideline of the G20 meeting, where there was a brief video of Modi going and shaking Xi Jinping's hand and then having a brief dialogue. But that's not a meeting, right? So that I think is important. But I don't think the idea that Beijing would disrupt India's SCO, chairpersonship, it makes no sense to me, given Beijing's strategic objective of what it wants to achieve with the SCO. As far as Pakistan visiting, again, you have to think of it in the broader sort of context of, Pakistan would want to engage with India. It is India which is placing, conditions saying, look, we can't have terror and dialogue, right? So from Pakistan's point of view, it's perfectly fine. And particularly given that Pakistan currently finds itself in an economic mess for more reasons than one, including natural reasons. For it, engagement is a positive outcome in that sense, right? So therefore, I don't think there was any way at any point of time a challenge. But I don't think any of these visits mean that the bilateral relationships between India and China and India and Pakistan are likely to improve.
Okay, so I mean, in a way, like countries, I mean, ought to, or they seem to figure out that they have to separate the multilateral engagements with their bilateral ones, even though these do provide a chance to, engage if you want to, like that happened in India in some way. But yeah, okay, so now, like, if we look at the remarks by the Chinese FM Chingang at the SEO, it was very interesting that it seems that show, as you also say in your newsletter, the objective that China sees with the SEO. So, can you talk about, like these five aspects that China thinks would be achieved in SEO?
I'll get to the 5 points that Chintang made at the SEO, but before that, just to dwell a little bit more on the bilateral issue between India and China. One of the focus points in the Indian media was remarks by the Chinese foreign minister about the boundary issue. And he said two things. One, he said that the current situation on the India-China borders is, quote, generally stable, unquote. And the other thing that he said is that he wants both sides to abide by relevant agreements, take joint action to further ease and cool down the border situation, and maintain sustainable peace and tranquility in the border areas. Now, this was seen, there was lots of interpretation going on about whether this means that Beijing's approach to the boundary has changed or is likely to change. What does he mean by cooling down? I think there's a lot of overreading into some of these things. I don't think the approach is going to change anytime soon. We are seeing a new status quo that's emerged in Ladakh, at least in eastern Ladakh, where the dispute began. And the dialogue that is going on is going on. We've seen some other places where there have been incidents and there has been tension. We've also seen some provocation with regard to, say, renaming of places in Arunachal Pradesh. I think that India should be extremely cautious over reading into any of these comments. I think the Chinese approach is long term, and so should ours be. So we should not be reading into too much into this. When Chingang says cool down, I think he means you cool down. Yeah. Rather than I should cool down. So he basically wants that.
So I have a question. So I mean, it seems like, or at least in the readouts, that India and China seem to be talking past each other. India is like, the situation is not normal. The situation right now has jeopardized the entire bilateral relationship. And as you also saw, like during the defense meeting as well, China seems to say that, like, let's not worry too much about border, or do you think they're talking past each other right now, or is it just like both are playing the long game where they're trying to dig in heels and hopefully there will be someone will relent, or there will be some opportunity where both can climb down? Like, how do you see that? Because it seems like both seem to be like not accepting what the actual status is.
I think both understand what the actual status quo on the boundary is, and the status has changed, right? And the status has changed because China has had expanded capacity, and it feels that it can exercise that capacity and that power to try and coerce India. Now, to what end, that is the question, right? Whether this coercion is to stymie India's infrastructure development, whether the coercion is to try and divert Indian resources towards the boundary as opposed to maritime development, whether the coercion is about pushing India into a corner, or sort of quote unquote teaching it a lesson so that it does not sort of become much closer to the United States and cautioning India on that, or whether it is all of the above. That is tricky, right? At least from what we know from Chinese statements, there is an element of all of this, right? So, but the fact is that it is using this coercion, and it feels that there is a certain right to use this coercion because you are the preeminent power in the region. From an Indian point of view, India is basically saying, look, we can't have a normal relationship with tensions on the border, which is sort of akin to what we're telling Pakistan, right? There's a certain condition for you to have a normal relationship with us. And Beijing is saying, you don't have the power to enforce that. So why are you asking for it? Accept this new status quo, accept our dominant role, and accept the coercion that we are meting out to you. To which India is saying, sorry, that is, we may not be, there may be an asymmetry, but we're not going to be pushed around, right? I think it's a tricky situation. And I think from an Indian point of view, I would say the only approach that best serves our interests is to be patient, is to continue to build our capacity, and is to not yield to the coercion for any short-term political gains or short-term sort of gains because you feel that there is going to be escalation. I think we should be prepared if there is escalation, because that is the only way for us to be able to deal with this coercion, because once you give into it, there will be more. So to me, that's where I see the boundary issue. I wanted to move on to the SEO. Again, if you read Chingang's comments at the SEO summit, he makes 5 points, right? And all of them are fundamentally, well, not all of them, but predominantly they're about the role of the United States, right? The first point is he wants all SCO members to adhere to strategic autonomy. And, in that he specifically mentions pushing back against attempts by external forces to interfere in regional affairs and plot quote unquote color revolutions. This is about the United States and its influence. He talks about terrorism. And this is a fundamental concern that SCO members have all on across. He talks about the need to reject breaking of supply chains and maintaining smooth industrial supply chains. This is again about fundamentally about US policy and the shift in globalization that is taking place, economic globalization. The fourth point is about, pushing ahead with GDI, GSI, and GCI, which is the global development, global security, and global civilization initiatives, which are China's three big initiatives launched over the past since 2021, and last one was in March 2023. And again, all of these are fundamentally about building China's role as a responsible major power, but also undercutting the United States' role in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region. And finally, he talks about enhancing SCO's capacity by completing the accession of countries like Iran and Belarus. Again, worth seeing, Iran and Belarus, both countries very opposed to the United States, of course, have difficult relationship with the United States. Belarus, obviously, close ally of Russia. And, so these are his 5 core views of what the SCO should be doing. And if you can see beyond the terrorism picture, which is a regional complicated issue, you have all of it is about essentially creating an organization that mobilizes countries in the developing world, in the region, in Asia, around some degree of pushback against the United States. So that's his fundamental view of what he wants the SCO to be. And from an Indian point of view, the challenge is, what is the value of being in such an organization, given your growing proximity to the United States and the fact that it's not just growing proximity, but it is the most strategically significant relationship for you.
Yeah, so I mean, it is quite fascinating that, in his statements, China would call out the specific terrorist movements in its Xinjiang region and around the area, but would not call out Pakistan. Although that entire statement could easily, mean that India would be applicable to Pakistan, at least in the context of India. So, I mean, given that a lot of these concerns seem to be, very China centric, there have been discussions or trying to understand why is India in the SCO in the first place. And we saw the Indian foreign minister tried to, I think, explain this during one of his interactions, that it is a way to engage with Central Asia and to ensure that India has a voice in Central Asia. And so how valid do you think that argument is, in the sense that does India does it serve India's purpose to be in SCO in any way? Because I mean, if SCO is a organization which has almost all countries in Eurasia and is now expanding further, so I mean it recently also added UAE as a dialogue partner as well. So is there any use of India being in SCO, or is it just we're confused as we are with BRICS or RIC, or how do you see that?
I'm a little torn about this. I don't think I necessarily have a coherent view on this. Just to add to, firstly, before I get to what my incoherent view on this is, just to add, it's not just the UAE, but the UAE, Kuwait, Maldives, Myanmar, all joined as dialogue partners,
wow. Yeah.
Which is interesting. But why am I torn about this? Is because I can see in theory the logic of, the SCO allowing India to essentially be part of discussions, particularly after the US withdrawal in Afghanistan, to be part of discussions in terms of the emerging continental security landscape that India faces. Now, even there, I think there are challenges, right? For example, a couple of years ago, after the US withdrawal in Afghanistan, at the sidelines of the SCO meeting, I think it's in one of the Central Asian countries, I can't remember, there was a meeting of, on Afghanistan, from which most SCO members were part of that meeting, whereas India was not included. So even in those blocks, you can be excluded. But I can see the logic of India needing to be part of this security framework that is being discussed around terrorism, around extremism, around connectivity in Eurasia, because this is one of the key bodies through which at least dialogue is taking place, and it has given an there has been some opening where we had the India Central Asia Summit, the first ever India Central Asia Summit, a while back. Our engagement with Central Asian countries is extremely limited. Our trade is extremely limited. It's marginal compared to say China or Russia's engagement. So we're new in that sense, but this region is very critical to our broader security. On Afghanistan, again, it's important for India to be part of this conversation on Afghanistan. And we've heard reports of possibly a new grouping of 4 countries: Russia, India, China, and Pakistan, that could establish some sort of dialogue. I think this is a Russian proposal. So it's important for India to be engaged in this region. And I see the value of that. Particularly, I see the value of, not staying out. I don't know how much you can do by being in, but by being out, you perhaps suffer more damage. So to that extent,
like the idea of India can sabotage any proposal which is not very in line, very much in how do you hold that argument, or is it just being wishful thinking?
I don't think of sabotage in that sense. I think India, what this Indian government has shown is that, India, and I think even previous Indian governments, that India will follow its interests, right? There's quite a bit of pragmatism. And, one could say that pragmatism is very narrowly focused. It's not stepping back and looking at the world from a strategic lens. It's looking at from a narrow, near-term interest perspective. And that can be a legitimate criticism of Indian foreign policy. But I think that it is worth being in the group to be able to shape outcomes, or if at least not shape outcomes that may be positive for you, at least delay, deter outcomes that may be negative consequences to you, right? Now, one can call that sabotage. I don't think it's sabotage. I think it's, and again, particularly as the grouping broadens, and when you have countries like Maldives in there, these are countries that are important to India's broader security, right? So I think that it's worthwhile being in the group. On the flip side, I do see the strategic fallout, right? There is a strategic fallout in the sense that if US-China competition worsens, we're today at a very bad stage. Both Americans and Chinese analysts tend to describe this as the worst phase since normalization in 78. We're at an impasse which is going to last for the foreseeable future between the US and China. How bad this contest gets, one has to wait and see. But I think that context, if you are part of a grouping which is seen as fundamentally anti-American, then, it's tricky. Now, that said, it's worth noting that the United Arab Emirates is a close partner of the United States, and it's now a dialogue partner in the SCO. So India is not the only country that is doing this uncomfortable balancing act. Others are too doing it. And at the same time, while both UAE and India are India is now a member of the SCO, UAE is a dialogue partner. At the same time, you're seeing the I2U2 partnership, where the UAE is there. And just today, we've had reports of the NSAs of Saudi Arabia, India, the UAE, and the US meeting. So I think there's a lot of flux at present. But on India and the SCO, I see the logic of being party to it. I don't think that being party to the SCO is suddenly going to expand our economic and security engagement with Central Asia manyfold. That's a structural problem. It's going to take a long time. But I see the value of being at the table. At the same time, being at that table can have consequences in terms of your partnership with the United States. And perhaps that's the cost that we need to be willing to bear, because from our point of view, from India's point of view, the Indo-Pacific is not just the oceans, it's also the continental domain. So we need to think of both of these. So that's how sort of my take is. Like I said, it's not a clear forward, stand. It's not a straightforward stand, but I think it's a complex issue. And, if on the balance I was to make the choice, I would also say that it's better that we are in the SCO.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I think as SCO expands, and as I think more dialogue partners become observers and observers become members, it might not be as much of an anti-US grouping anymore, is because I wonder how much of Central Asia or West Asian countries, or even countries in South Asia, would like to be part of a explicitly anti-US grouping. So maybe the expansion would try to maybe tone down the anti-US orientation of SCO with time, or I don't know. I also don't.
So I don't think that will happen. I think the SCO will fundamentally remain, because look at the people who are driving the agenda, right? It's China fundamentally and Russia. and both of them have increasingly, the Russian relationship with the United States is currently is in the dustbin. And if you look at the Chinese relationship with the United States, it's
on its way to
like I
dustbin.
said, it's on its way there. So I think that it's not like this is going to change. I think the SCO will fundamentally remain an anti-American bloc in some degree, but there will be more objectives. And it's not just about anti. Like, say, terrorism is one key part of it, and this is something that the region feels that it needs to address. I mean, has the SCO been effective in addressing it? Of course,
Yeah.
but it is an agenda which brings countries together. The stability of Afghanistan is an issue that they feel that the countries in the region need to address. And can you arrive at certain formulations to try and do that? I think this is exploration that's taking place. So it's an agenda beyond that, but the idea that the US of counterbalancing against the US will be a key part of the SEO movement, irrespective. I will differ with you on BRICS and RIC. I think RIC again is late 90s. It came into being, 1998 essentially. Was a different era, different purpose. Today, to me, it serves really no purpose, and it's an informal thing. It's not a, it's not like a formal block which is doing whatever. It's an informal meeting that takes place, and that's fine. BRICS, I fundamentally, again, I think we're looking at it from today's lens, but if you look at when BRICS came into being, it was for a very different purpose. And what you're seeing today is that Beijing is trying, I mean, if you go to the BRICS summit last year, what you will see is that the Chinese essentially said, oh, we want to try and see if we can, put into motion the global security initiative under the BRICS. Why? BRICS was supposed to be an economic entity, right? Security elements did play a role, but it was supposed to be an economic grouping. So the Chinese are going to try and, and of course, as the Russian relationship with the West goes bad, even the Russians are sort of in agreement with that idea. So India, however, can sort of push back on that, right? And again, Brazil is an interesting actor. Last year, Bolsonaro was president, and his comments at the BRICS and South Africa's comments at the BRICS were not necessarily reflective of the Chinese and Russian agenda. Today, with Lula, you might see a little bit more congruence in that agenda. But how much of that will be security related? Who knows? At an economic level, yes, there might be. So again, I think that it's valuable for India to keep playing a part in BRICS because it's beyond just, and it's valuable for India to also, in the BRICS, at least you can drive the agenda. In the SCO, it's very difficult to drive the agenda.
Okay.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Now, if we turn back to Qin Gang's visit, so from India, he goes to Pakistan, where he meets with leaders from Afghanistan as well. So how do you see, the outcome of the Pakistan, Afghanistan, China trilateral? It seems like in the at least statement, it says that, they would like Afghanistan to be a part of BRI, which I think is a statement that is, it's been said that that is an ambition for a very long time, but it has not fructified. So do you see it? Like things have changed, or is it just like a reinforcement of what the broader idea has been, but not really much into how to implement it?
Yeah, I think that, it's really useful to think of what Qin Gang did when he went to Pakistan. The first thing is that he met with, except for the Pakistani Prime Minister, he met with every key stakeholder, right? He met with the Pakistani president, he met with the army chief, he met with Bilawal Bhutto, who was his counterpart. So he had quite compare that to his visit to India, right? Where he met with his counterpart, he attended the SCO, and he was out. So that just tells you a little bit about the depth of the relationship. Another interesting sort of bilateral development between China and Pakistan was, Qin Gang addressing young diplomats from both countries. And I'll quote from some of his comments, right? He said that China-Pakistan ties were a, quote, model of state-to-state relations, a living textbook that should be studied, and a good story that everyone should try and tell. So, he sort of talks up the bilateral relationship as being this ironclad partnership. And the Pakistani army chief talked again about, the relationship being sweeter than honey and all those epithets. So, it tells you that there is a lot of, that this congruence sort of sustains between the two sides, although there are deep issues with regard to implementation of CPEC, delays in implementation of CPEC, around security for Chinese personnel, institutions, all of that. Recently, a Chinese citizen was caught up charged under the Pakistani blasphemy law.
Yes.
And that had become a huge deal. But very quietly, the case was withdrawn and the person was allowed to go. So these are the kind of challenges that they have. And this is long standing, this is going to sustain. In Pakistan, also, one of the big messages that Chingang had for the current leadership, but also for the young diplomats, was that you should be pushing back against anything that stokes a new cold war. So again, it just tells you a little bit about the prism with which he went to the country. On the trilateral engagement between Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan, I think it's really interesting that if you go and look at what the Chinese have been saying on Afghanistan, at one level you will see a lot of talk about how once the US has now exited Afghanistan, it's sort of open season for China, and China will enter in, and it will take over all these mineral resources that Afghanistan has and natural resources, and it's going to sort of make hay while the sun shines, and there's going to be lots of gain for China. But if you actually look at what Chinese policy has been with regard to Afghanistan, there has been expanded business presence, but there have been terrorist attacks which have specifically targeted Chinese citizens. There was a Chinese diplomat who was visiting a hotel who was specifically targeted. At that point of time, was not in the hotel, and so there have been specific instances, right? The Taliban has. And there have been instances because there's a division in Afghanistan between different entities and different groups, right? And it's difficult for, say, the Taliban to try and control some of the other groups because you get pushback, about selling out and all of that. So it's difficult for the Taliban to also control some of these attacks. Just a few weeks ago in April, the Chinese government issued a position paper on Afghanistan. It has 11 points, and I think it's worth everybody going through it to try and understand this trilateral meeting and what it means. And if you see that position paper, when I had covered it, it basically, a lot of it essentially talked about terrorism, security. A lot of it was focused on terrorism and security. So it was essentially a threat prism through which Beijing was looking at Afghanistan, as opposed to a prism of opportunities, right? The ETIM and cracking down on ETIM was a key part of it. The paper actually said that, China hopes that Afghanistan will fulfill its commitments in earnest and take more effective measures to crack down on all terrorist forces, including the ETIM, with greater determination, protect Chinese citizens and institutions, and so on and so forth. It talks about, Afghanistan must address root causes of terrorism, stop not be a safe haven or breeding ground for terrorism. It talks about the fact that extremism remains the biggest threat. So I'm reading 3-4 points from 11-point paper, which essentially talks about security challenges as opposed to anything else. So that, I think, is the first thing that everyone must keep in mind whenever we think of what Pakistan, China might get from Afghanistan. In terms of the trilateral meeting that took place, if you look at the outcomes, I mean, again, Chingang pitched GDI, GSI, GCI. He talked about BRI, but there has been no extension of BRI. Again, because security has been a big challenge. He talked about 4 broad agreements that came out from the trilateral meeting. One is, that we must respect each other's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and properly address differences and disputes through equal consultation. This is really important because ever since the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan, you have seen significant friction between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Yeah. You've been firing across the borders have closed, there's been challenges with regard to the Durand line. So it's not easy. And China finds itself trapped between trying to negotiate between these two entities and manage the dispute between them. So extension of CPEC into Afghanistan is something that we should be, we shouldn't sort of anticipate any of this to happen in a hurry, right? So that's the first thing. The second point that they talked about was, again, counterterrorism cooperation. And that's a huge part. It's significant for both countries, China and Afghanistan. And Beijing is not even accorded recognition to the Taliban regime, and it's unlikely to. The challenge remains with regard to terrorism. They talked about restarting dialogue mechanisms as your third agreement. We're starting with the foreign minister dialogue, and then talk about other economic issues such as trade, agriculture, poverty reduction, whatever. And finally, expanding BRI and improving the cross-border trade system. Again, like I said, we'll have to wait and see whether this happens. I'm not holding my breath and saying that this is going to happen imminently, because the fundamental point is that Beijing's view on Afghanistan is not an opportunity perspective. It is a threat perspective and mitigating that threat perspective. And that is likely to persist. It is not likely to shift anytime soon, at least the way things stand.
Yeah, I was wondering. I mean, given like till a decently functioning state like Pakistan, if Chinese investments and individuals are facing threats in Pakistan, how safe is Afghanistan? Which is not, I mean, a functioning state per se. So in that way, I think the threat perception is increased manyfold. So you would wonder that how would like China try to invest, let's say, in Afghanistan? And I mean, it's also like a bit in contrast to, let's say, the India's approach to Afghanistan, which I mean, obviously, we would like it to be secure, but India's focus has been also more on the developmental aspect of relationship. So that also is an interesting contrast.
Yeah, I mean, look, what the Chinese have been able to do ever since the American withdrawal is that let's just look at the economic engagement of Afghanistan, right? A lot of the larger investments, right? So whether it's regard to the copper mine investment or whether it's regard to other things, extraction of oil, etc. All of these have been extremely slow because there are legacy disputes that have been associated, and those are not really moved forward. There are certain small companies, small Chinese companies. So there has been an expansion of Chinese economic engagement. So certain small companies which dealt with things like animal hides, human hair, some degree of rare earth extraction, they did enter in, and there is some of that trade. A lot, some of this is illegal also, and that's taking place. And there are certain companies which are sort of medium in scale. They have either government contracts or whatever, and they are working in exclusive zones where Chinese are living or things like that, where there is data protection. But there has been nothing massive from a Chinese perspective in economic engagement, and it is extremely difficult for that to happen. People who've traveled to Afghanistan in the last couple of years do say that there is increased Chinese presence, but then again, like I said, that has come with expanded, terrorist threat to the Chinese, and that's pushed them back further. Also, I think Beijing understands that there are certain factions, like I said, which have some degree of recognition with the Uyghur issue, right? And they do sort of, they are uncomfortable with China's handling of the situation in Xinjiang. And there are these hardline groups which the Taliban has to sort of keep in mind. So I think that's why any of this engagement is going to be tricky. Even India's development engagement, I mean, has been gradual with the Afghanistan. And the idea has been that you try and establish contact because you need to now deal with the entity that you previously did not want to deal with. But it's not like Indian businesses are rushing in or anything like that, right? Because security remains the primary concern. And like you said, if security is the primary challenge in Pakistan, which has at least a established state machinery, particularly with the armed forces in control, in Afghanistan, it's even more challenging, right?
Yeah.
And I think that to me remains Beijing's primary concern with regard to Afghanistan more than anything else.
So I had this one question I wanted to ask you. So if you look at the statement, like the China-Pakistan statement, so it says that China is willing to enhance cooperation with Pakistan in security, capacity building, and security system. So I mean, there was a lot of talk about the safety and security of Chinese citizens. So there has been talk about talks, I mean slash some concern in India that there might be a case or a situation where China might deploy private security forces or security forces in Pakistan to try to offset this risk, which seems like Pakistan is not been able to handle it pretty well. Where do you see that going? And second, given the almost regular breakout of hostility between Afghanistan and Pakistan along the border, is there first capacity and second willingness in China to try to work around some solution, something to make the Afghanistan-Pakistan border more stable, or that is a bridge too far?
So my understanding is that at present there is no physical involvement that Beijing would be interested in trying to manage somebody else's borders. That's a quagmire that you don't want to get yourself involved in. And I don't think that Beijing is interested in getting itself involved in. What it is interested in doing is it is interested in pressurizing both sides to try and, play nice. In terms of, private security contractors, it's been some time that there has been this dialogue about what can China do. And what we've seen is that, with each progressive, say, attack on Chinese personnel and there have been a significant
Mhm.
number of them. I mean, if I could just recount some, in April 2021, there was a bombing in Quetta, which targeted the Chinese ambassador, then Ambassador Nong Rong. In July 2021, there was an attack in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in which 9 Chinese workers were killed. Then August 2021, suicide bombing in Gwadar. Then in April 2022, an attack on the Confucius Institute in Karachi. And in some of these cases, what we've seen is that China has sent investigators and police officials and things like that, and teams like this to try and conduct investigations. And that to me is a reflection of unease with how Pakistan has dealt with some of these cases, right? And in some of these cases, the Chinese have said that it's their work, particularly things like getting data from cell phones, footage enhancement technology, use of technology, which has helped crack some of these cases. To me, that is a reflection of, mistrust and distrust between these two partners. In terms of deployment of private security personnel, I think Beijing is very, very cautious about whether it wants to deploy the PAP or the PLA, because that comes with significant costs domestically in Pakistan, because you are then seen as, to some degree, an occupying force creating an enclave for yourself. So it would be far more comfortable to use private security contractors who are hired by enterprises. But even that, the Pakistani government has resisted so far. So there has been no evidence that there have been any private security contractors that have been deployed. So I read some of these remarks by Chingang about, trying to enhance cooperation and security capacity building to be perhaps in part to do with, more technology, more sort of joint probes and things like that. Um, but also perhaps pushing much more for presence of private Chinese security contractors, which is a reflection, like I said, of distrust from the Chinese side. But from the Pakistani side is the case of, well, look, we can handle things on our own. You don't need to be involved because it's a matter of sovereign integrity and things like that. So this is a friction point which I think will continue to sustain. And the day Pakistan gives in to some of this, I think it will also be a lot of challenges domestically, politically, for Pakistani politicians, because the narrative will be about China being an occupying force.
Plus, I think so. Also, kind of go against. I mean, if the whole idea is, Pakistan, at least in the minds of Pakistanis and the Pakistan army, the moment they agree to it, either willfully or through coercion in some way, that it's an acceptance that Pakistan cannot handle this, and that is like a dent in their own self-image as well, however good or bad
I,
that is.
I agree.
Okay, so I mean, at the end, I mean, would you say that any presence of Chinese security forces, Chinese private security forces, would this have any impact on India in any way, in any capacity? Like it provides, like kind of an enclave for Chinese to, do their own operations, or I mean, there is no evidence as of yet that like this will happen. But does India have an interest in ensuring that this doesn't happen?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, we don't want to see Chinese forces in Pakistan, but then there is very little that we can do about it. So it's something that we would have very little control over. I think if Chinese forces are present in Pakistan, there would be a security challenge from an Indian point of view, but it also, again, like I said, it creates a certain domestic situation within Pakistan, which may not be as, again, that sometimes the tighter the embrace, the more the difficulties. So, it depends. It depends. But I think whether it affects our interests or not, the problem is, the challenge will be that, look, we have very little say in something like that, right? So, I mean, one would have to think about it, depending on what the kind of deployment is, what the kind of role is, and all of that. But yeah, there's very little that India can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so at the end of it, I mean, I'll request you to like graze on a crystal ball and see. I mean, so if Xi Jinping comes for SCO, I mean, it seems like he might. Is there a chance that he might not come for G20, or like how does it? How does China see G20? I mean, apart from the fact that like India is the chair this year, like does China see the utility of G20? So it wants to at least not discredit the G20 system, or do you think any decision of of the Chinese president coming depends on the fact that who is the host and not the G20 structure?
I think it would be foolhardy for Xi Jinping to not attend in both the SCO and the G20 summits. I think it would be important for him to attend both of those meetings. I think from an Indian point of view, we will be wanting to host even Vladimir Putin. If Putin is coming, Xi Jinping is coming. I don't think that's not happening. I mean, even if Putin is not coming, there is a certain issue that depending on what happens. I don't think the Indians will. I don't think our side is going to not invite Vladimir Putin. So I have a feeling that you will see both of them, and you will see a lot of friction. It is going to be a difficult summit to manage in terms of expectations. I think what India did in late February, March, when we had the G20 foreign ministers meeting, where you put out the statement while highlighting that these paragraphs, these countries did not agree. I think that is a good workable solution. And I think it also shows from an Indian side a certain degree of resolve to try and not issue a statement because there is disagreement, but put it out there saying that XYZ countries don't agree with you. It also sends a message to your partners in the West. So yeah, my broad sense is that I don't think Xi Jinping will want to, particularly the SCO, but even the G20, I don't think that he will be wanting to undermine them. It won't be good for his own policy objectives. China doesn't want to be seen as an irresponsible global power for other sort of G20 countries also. So it would therefore make sense for him to attend. But then, we'll wait. G20 is still a long time away.
Yeah.
The SCO Summit is earlier.
We'll see how SCO goes, because I think both Putin and Xi would be here, hopefully, and that would maybe set the tone, of how this will be managed in September. Where
I'm looking forward to seeing whether we get a bilateral meeting between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, and what the outcomes of that bilateral meeting are.
So, is it likely? I mean, obviously, it's a lot of it just conjecture here, but is it more likely to get a meeting, if at all, after during SCO than during G20?
Yeah, I think during the SCO, because it's coming first and India is a host. So it is likely that you will. Now, it's not mandatory that there will be a bilateral meeting, but it's something that can be arranged by both sides. And if that does happen, I think it will be worth looking at what the outcomes are. So, for example, last year when the SCO Summit happened, we did not get a bilateral meeting between Modi and Xi Jinping. But given that India is a host this year, it's likely that might happen. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
Okay. Thanks, Manoj. Thank you for the time. And I hope to have a new podcast during the SCO meeting, hopefully discussing the bilateral meeting between India and China.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Manoj.
Thanks.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.